Thank you for joining us. Our subject today is about education. President John F. Kennedy said, "Let us think of education as the means of developing our greatest abilities, because in each of us there is a private hope and a dream, which when fulfilled can be translated into benefit for everyone and greater strength for our nation." We're here in Jacksonville, Florida at the Hyatt Regency Hotel, attending the International Convention of the AECT, the Association for Educational Communications and Technology. This is a professional association of thousands of educators, all dedicated to improving instruction through technology. And for us to learn more about this essential subject, we have Cynthia Burfield on location, and she'll be speaking with Dr. Michael Simonson of Nova Southeastern University, and later with Dr. Abram Fischler, President Emeritus of Nova Southeastern University, following these messages.
With us now is Dr. Simonson of Nova Southeastern University, and we're here in Jacksonville, Florida for the AECT conference. Why is this conference important?
Well, in our profession, there are two organizations that are really critical. One is AECT, the Association for Educational Communications and Technology, the conference we're at now. The other is the United States Distance Learning Association. It's important to all of us because this is where the basic ideas of the field are communicated, where the leaders go to learn and where the leaders go to share what they've learned with others. My first AECT conference was about 40 years ago, and since then I've gone almost every year and had the opportunity to meet with people who are both learning about the field and have learned about the field so that I can gain some experience and also share some of my own experiences. There's another reason also. My father was a member of the Department of Audiovisual Instruction, which was the predecessor of AECT.
Oh, wow.
And so I was associated with the association and the conference that they've held for almost over 50 years now. So it's always been a place where I've gone to be renewed and to learn about the field.
Dr. Simonson, we're in an era where technology is very important and people are learning through technology. Please tell me about any confusions there are and misunderstandings with regard to instructional technology.
Especially when it comes to learning, there's a lot of confusion because intuitively we think if we use powerful technologies, there's going to be some positive impact on learning, when in fact, the technologies just allow us to access information and processes that will assist our learning. A guy named Richard Clark about 40 years ago made it very clear that media are mere vehicles that do not influence achievement any more than the delivery truck influences our nutrition. Now, we're glad we have delivery trucks. We're glad we can have ice cream in the middle of the summer. We're glad we can have fruit in the middle of the winter. But it's the fruit that is the critical thing when we're enhancing our nutrition. It's the content of instruction and it's the approaches that are used that's critical. There is this counterintuitive concept that most people have to think about before they start to realize that the efficiencies of instructional technologies, the processes, the ability to access information are much more important than just the fact we're using an iPod or an iPhone or a laptop or a video camera or even the internet. Those technologies of instruction allow us to access information, allow us to understand in a way because we're able to see multiple options rather than just the fact that we're using those technologies. The critical thing here, and most of us learn about this relatively slowly because it is counterintuitive, is it's how we design instruction that's more important than the kinds of technologies we use in the teaching and learning process.
Very interesting. When we're talking about complex learning environments, my question is with regard to the research. How do we measure learning in like a simulation type situation? Because it's supposed to be experimental learning. You have a variable.
Experiential.
Talk to us about experiential learning and problem-based learning, and what is your perception about those?
Those are very popular concepts today. The whole idea of situating the teaching process in real-world activities is very powerful. If resource extensive way to provide instruction. Now, if we're going to use these powerful technologies, technologies that require, and approaches that require an outlay of resources, a considerable outlay of resources, then we have to have some evidence that they're going to be effective. They are effective. Problem-based learning is effective. Situated instruction is effective. The use of the technologies to bring us to the real world are effective. The interesting thing is they're not significantly more effective than other approaches. So when we design instruction, we need to balance what the resources are that we have available to us with the potential for effective learning. And that's why it would be very reluctant to want to have all of our instruction in a situated or a problem-based environment, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. On the other hand, we don't want to do everything in a teacher-directed learning environment, because while that's much less complex and much easier in terms of resource allocation and even instructional design, it doesn't provide that richness of experience that we need, the kinds of examples that help us really understand and establish in long-term learning those concepts that are being presented. And that uncovers a whole other issue, and that is, how do you directly measure something that's indirect in the teaching process? Most of us understand that standardized tests are not very effective at determining how much a person understands something from a perspective of the in-depth learning. So we have to start to look at how we assess learning in a way that's not as easy as the standardized test, but that relates to the complexity of the teaching process. A fellow named Edgar Dale, about 60 years ago, developed something called the cone of experience. And the cone of experience basically said the most abstract kind of experience is at the top of the cone, which would be a written experience. You read about what it's like to be a sponge fisherman in Greece. At the bottom of the cone of experience is a direct, purposeful experience, where you actually go to Greece, you sign on to a sponge fisherman's boat, and you spend 6 weeks learning what it's like to be a sponge fisherman. Well, most of us don't want to do that for everything we want to learn. It's pretty easy to read about a sponge fisherman, maybe in the Encyclopedia Britannica, but probably somewhere in between the most abstract and least resource approach, written, and the direct purposeful experience, actually living through something, there are various levels of technologies that we can use. Well, we have to have the same kind of assessment strategies. When we decide we're going to look at a National Geographic video of a day in the life of a Greek sponge fisherman, that's somewhere along this continuum between abstract and real, and also along the continuum between how much resources it takes and whether or not it's efficient in terms of what we can do in a classroom. So that's part of the complexity, and sometimes counterintuitive complexities, of the use of technologies in the teaching and learning process.
Very good. And the instructional design models that we have today, I've been reading that some of them are outdated, and they need to be transformed, and we need new models to design instruction for these new types of situated and experiential learning.
Yeah, I come down pretty traditionally on that question, where the instructional design models that we've been using for decades, all based upon general systems theory, based upon instructional systems theory, the models like the Dick and Carey model and some of the other what people call linear sequential models, where you actually have a step-by-step process by which you design instruction, are, in my opinion, and based on the evidence I've seen, just as effective today with the hypermedia kinds of learning environments as they were 50 years ago. Why are they effective? Because they allow us to plan and to produce and anticipate issues before they occur in terms of teaching and learning, and also be able to fairly accurately predict the effectiveness of the strategies that we're designing. So I would be reluctant to ignore the traditional models in favor of some newer, seemingly more appropriate for the technologies we're using today, but untested models that some are proposing. Now, when you take that in hand, I, for example, have proposed a model for the design of online instruction, which is the unit module topic approach. Well, that's not really an instructional design model. It's a way to take a body of content and organize it so that you can deliver it to a group of students in a distance learning environment without the need for synchronous instruction or out the traditional face-to-face class. So we have a variety of models, some new, some traditional. From a purely instructional design perspective, I would always advocate that we stick with the traditional models, understand them first, and then we can make decisions about whether it's appropriate for us to modify those traditional models or at least examine the newer models that are being proposed.
How do the theories of learning relate to what we already know about instructional technology?
Well, that's a good question, because the educational psychologists are proposing a lot of new ideas about how people learn and how we process information. Whether you're a behaviorist from the old school or a cognitive theorist or a constructivist today, there are attempts made to adapt instructional technologies to produce more effective instruction, which will have a positive impact on learning. What the technologies have evolved to today with the internet, the web, the hypermedia approaches, the access of learning objects through a variety of means, kind of plays right into what the theorists are telling us about how people learn. In other words, we chunk information, but we don't provide it in these little pieces in a sequential order all the time. We provide information to people in these little pieces of knowledge. I would call them single concepts. Other people call them learning objects, in a way that is variable and is adaptable. And we can, for the novice learner, provide them with a sequential structure, step 1, step 2, step 3. And then as we get more sophisticated, we may want to have our 15 steps in a process to how to do something, let's say a mathematical proof. We may want to drop back, we want to move forward, we may want to provide a variety of approaches. Well, the technologies we now have available that are hypermedia, whether they're computer-based or whether they're web-based or internet-based, allow us to match the learning style information, the theories of learning that the educational psychologists are providing to us. I would say, however, that the processes that we are starting to understand about how people think and how they learn don't always directly play into how we should be designing instruction. There's another issue there, and that is we're starting to learn how people understand. We're starting to look at the way we think about things ourselves, metacognition, and we're starting to develop more powerful kinds of technologies that allow us to access things in a random order or in an order of our own choosing, but we're not really sure about what's the best match between those two somewhat separate but similar bodies of knowledge. And that's why the field of instructional technology and the association AECT is so important, because it's here where we learn about instructional design. The critical idea, the intellectual technique of the people at this conference, of the people in the field that I represent, is that we approach learning problems using the strategy of instructional design, instructional systems design. So we think about the problem that way. And one of the inputs we have is the knowledge we have about theories of learning, about how people process information. And we also have expertise in the technologies, in the media, in the digital tools that are available, so we can match the two. And that's what's important, I think, about the field of instructional technology, is that we don't just understand how people learn or understand how to produce technological tools, technological instruction, technology-based instruction, but we know how to merge the two. And that's the critical point.
So these psychologies, stuff we know about learning and how people learn, are integrated into the design models?
Well, they should be. Most effective instructional designers do a critical assessment. It's either a formal assessment or it can be sometimes an intuitive assessment of the learning group. And included in that is, what do I know about how people in this kind of a context process information? What's the best strategy? Back to my Edgar Dale thing. Well, that's a simple hierarchy of technologies. But we also now are starting to understand a little better about how people process information cognitively. Back in the day of the behaviorists, B.F. Skinner, the behaviorists were called behaviorists because all they could do is observe your behavior to have understanding about what your brain was doing. We couldn't look inside the brain. And so we said, well, what can you do as a consequence of instruction? So I'm going to design instruction that produces measurable, observable responses, behaviors, performance. Well, now we're starting to understand that there are all kinds of ways to ascertain how I think and what I think and the process by which I can access information more effectively. And so we're starting to integrate that into the tools that we have, back to the Dale's cone of experience, which is really a cone of instructional technologies. And the decisions are the hard part. What's the most effective and manageable process? I mean, we could spend a lot of time with our resources and our planning teams, but most of us have to design instruction to be delivered within a few days, a few weeks, and at most a few months. And so we don't have all the strategy. We don't have all the time to apply all the strategies that we know. So while most of us, myself included, think that teaching and learning are more science than art, there is still a lot of this intuitiveness and creativeness in the teaching and learning process.
Absolutely. With regard to adult learners, can we mesh them into one group and say, well, adult learners have this particular learning style or learner characteristic?
Well, I think your learning style, if I understand the psychologist, is something that you're stuck with for life.
Individual. Or characteristics, I would like
well,
to
the characteristics of the learner we're stuck with life. What happens to us when we get older? What happens to us when we get out of school and we go to work? Well, we become more reliant on our environment, and that's different than the school environment, where we're either being provided with experiences that help us learn, or we are being directed to do things that hypothetically practically will help us learn. Whereas as we age, as we get older, if we move into our 30s and 40s, we're probably learning either in an environment where we have to learn to keep our job or to be successful, or we're learning by doing things. We're actually living our lives and learning the consequences of our actions. Well, both of those approaches are counter to the and maybe a little foreign to the classroom-based or the formal educational-based activities. One of the problems that we face when we offer our graduate programs to the adult learner, and the average student in the program I'm involved with is about 45 to 50, is they tend to have a little bit different perspective about the teaching learning process. They tend to be more self-motivating, or at least think they're more self-motivated and self-directing. And so we have to design instruction that doesn't necessarily meet what their expectations are, but lets them understand that their expectations are not always accurate expectations. Sometimes you have to learn in a way that you learned back when you were in middle school or high school, even though you've had a world of experiences since you left the formal educational setting.
Let's look at this from a perspective of the general public, the taxpayers. What should they know about instructional technology?
That's a fun question. That's a very good question. They think they know a lot because we are inundated with technologies, and we assume that these technologies are good and powerful and maybe inevitable. I have to tell a story, though. I went to a conference about 30 years ago where the theme of the conferences was, what are we going to do about the technologists? That the theme was that the biggest threat, the major threat to education, was the infusion of technology into the teaching learning process. And that was a pretty popular belief about 30 years ago. That's changed. Now the major issues are, how do we overcome these misconceptions people have about instructional technologies? Big problem is you put smart boards, you put internet connections, you put smartphones, you put laptop computers in the schools, but we get rid of the people who are most appropriate to help learners use those tools, the school library media specialists. And so we're doing a pretty good job of familiarizing people with these powerful tools that we can use, but we're not doing a very good job of informing the taxpayer, the public in general, that in order to make those tools effective, we need highly qualified, trained people. And it's not just the school teacher, but it's those other individuals, the library media specialists. Most of us remember that librarian, that media specialist that we went to school more recently. They're the ones that helped us access all those powerful tools. They're the ones that helped us use the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature maybe, but now those are the people that help us understand how to use Google and how to use the web and how to search and how to be effective that way. So the biggest issue from the taxpayer's perspective is we're putting all this money in there, we want to see results. Well, the people that can help those results happen also have to be just as in high favor as do the hardware and software themselves. So that's an issue that I think is of critical importance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simonson. This has been very interesting.
You're welcome. A lot of fun.
Thank you.